Picture the ruler of the ancient Earth, and you almost certainly picture a dinosaur, a towering, scaly reptile roaring over a primeval swamp. But here is something that almost nobody is taught. There was an entire world before the dinosaurs, a world that lasted for tens of millions of years, ruled by creatures that were not reptiles at all. In fact, if you had stood on the land during that lost age and looked around at the dominant animals, the saber-toothed hunters and the tusked giants stalking the plains, you would not have been looking at the ancestors of lizards or crocodiles. You would have been looking at your own. Because the true rulers of the earth before the dinosaurs were not the ancestors of reptiles. They were the ancestors of us. This is the story of the world that time forgot, the strange dynasty that ruled the land long before the first dinosaur ever drew breath, and the single worst day in the entire history of life on this planet, the day that nearly ended everything and quietly handed the world to the dinosaurs. To understand this lost world, you have to erase almost everything you know. There are no dinosaurs. There are no birds in the sky, no flowers on the ground, no grass anywhere on Earth. The continents themselves are wrong. They have all crashed together into a single enormous landmass, one supercontinent called Pangaea. A single block of land stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by one vast world ocean. This is the Permian period, roughly 299 to 252 million years ago. And before we meet its rulers, we have to walk even further back into the age that set the stage, the Carboniferous. Because before the beasts, the earth belonged to the bugs, and not the small, harmless bugs you know. During the Carboniferous, the world was warm, wet, and blanketed in dense, swampy forests of towering tree ferns and giant club mosses. Forests so vast that their buried remains would one day become the coal that powered our own industrial age. That is literally where the name comes from, the coal-bearing age. But those forests did something else strange. The plants pumped so much oxygen into the atmosphere that the air itself became richer than it has ever been since, before or after. And that extra oxygen unlocked something monstrous. Insects and their relatives do not breathe with lungs. They take in air passively through tiny tubes running into their bodies, which normally limits how large they can grow. But crank up the oxygen and that ceiling lifts. So the arthropods grew into giants. Overhead droned Meganeura, a dragonfly-like predator with a wingspan of up to 70 centimeters, roughly the size of a hawk, hunting through the humid air on wings the length of your forearm. And across the forest floor crawled the true monster of the age, Arthropleura, a millipede-like creature that could grow to around 2.5 meters long, the largest land invertebrate that has ever existed, a segmented giant as long as a horse, rustling through the leaf litter with no natural enemies its own size. Alongside them, the very first reptiles were appearing, small and lizard-like, having just made the revolutionary leap of laying tough, shelled eggs on dry land, freeing their descendants from the water forever. The land was being colonized, the stage was being set, and then the world began to dry. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, the great swamps shrank and the interior of Pangaea became vast, harsh, and increasingly arid. The age of giant insects faded, and into that drying world stepped a new kind of animal, an animal with a backbone, 4 legs, and a skull that hid a secret. Look at the skull of one of these creatures, and behind each eye socket you would find a single opening in the bone, a single window in the side of the head where powerful jaw muscles could anchor. That one feature, that single hole, defines an entire dynasty. These animals are called synapsids. And that word matters more than almost any other in this story, because you are a synapsid. Every mammal alive today, every cat, every whale, every human being carries that same ancient signature in the skull. The synapsids were the first vertebrates to truly rule the land, and they are our own family, tens of millions of years before the first mammal. And the most famous of all the early synapsids is one you have almost certainly seen, and almost certainly mislabeled, Dimetrodon. That unmistakable predator with the enormous fan of skin, the great sail rising from its back, held up by long bony spines growing out of its spine. You have seen it in toy sets and picture books, usually thrown in among the dinosaurs. But Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It is not even close. Dimetrodon lived and died tens of millions of years before the first dinosaur existed, and it belongs to our branch of the tree, the synapsids. It walked on 4 sprawling legs, low and powerful, and its mouth was lined with teeth of 2 different sizes, sharp fangs at the front and slicing blades behind, which is exactly what its name means, 2 measures of teeth. It was one of the top predators of the early Permian, and that sail on its back was likely a tool for controlling its body temperature, catching the morning sun to warm up faster, or turning edge on to shed heat. A 4-legged, sail-backed hunter, sprawling in the Permian dawn, and one of your very distant cousins, not a dinosaur at all. But Dimetrodon and its early kin were only the opening act. As the Permian rolled on, the synapsids evolved into something more advanced, more active, more like us. This new wave is known as the therapsids, and with them the beasts truly took over the earth. The therapsids stood taller, with legs pulled in more directly beneath their bodies rather than splayed out to the sides, letting them move faster and breathe more easily as they ran. Their teeth grew more specialized, and there is good evidence that some of them were beginning to cross one of the most important lines in all of biology, the line toward being warm-blooded, generating their own internal heat, and possibly even growing the very first coat of hair. For tens of millions of years, in the late Permian, these creatures owned the land completely, and some of them were terrifying. The undisputed apex predators of this world were the Gorgonopsians. Imagine a powerful, big-headed beast the size of a bear or larger, moving with purpose across the dry Permian plains and jutting from its upper jaw a pair of enormous curved saber teeth, like daggers of bone. The Gorgonopsians were the first great sabre-toothed hunters on Earth, and they hunted this way more than 200 million years before the famous saber-toothed cats of the Ice Age were even dreamed of. Same brutal solution, stabbing fangs to bring down large prey, invented by our own reptile-like relatives an unimaginably long time before mammals reinvented it. When a Gorgonopsian charged, the Permian world trembled, and what were they hunting? Often the dicynodonts. These were the great herbivores of the age, and they were everywhere, in some places the most abundant large animals on the entire planet. Dicynodonts were stocky, barrel-bodied plant eaters, ranging from the size of a rat to the size of an ox, and some later kinds grew as large as a modern rhinoceros. Their name means 2 dog teeth because most of them had lost nearly all their teeth except for a pair of tusks jutting from the upper jaw, and a tough, turtle-like beak for cropping vegetation. They dug, they browsed, they gathered in herds, and they fed the predators. Picture vast plains of these tusked, beaked grazers stretching to the horizon under a harsh Permian sun, with the saber-toothed Gorgonopsians moving among them like the lions of a world with no lions yet born. And hidden among all these giants was a smaller, quieter group that mattered more than any of them. The Cynodonts. These were smaller synapsids, some no bigger than a dog, many the size of a rat, and at first glance far less impressive than the saber-toothed hunters that shared their world. But look closely, and you are looking at the future. The Cynodonts, whose name means dog teeth, had jaws and skulls creeping ever closer to the mammal condition. Their teeth were dividing into the different shapes we still have, for cutting and for crushing. Their jaw was becoming dominated by a single strong bone. And crucially, many of them showed little pits in the bone of the snout, exactly where the nerves for whiskers run in a mammal, a strong hint that these animals had sensitive whiskers and therefore very likely fur, warm blood, whiskers, specialized teeth. Somewhere in this modest group of Permian survivors is the direct line that leads, eventually, to every mammal that has ever lived, including you. So let us be absolutely clear about what this world was. For tens of millions of years, the dominant land animals on Earth, the top predators and the great herbivores alike, were not reptiles and were not dinosaurs. They were synapsids, the proto-mammals, our own ancient relatives. The dinosaurs did not exist yet. The age of reptiles had not begun. This was, in a very real sense, the first age of the beasts, and it was ruled by the ancestors of mammals. If nothing had changed, the story of life on land might have belonged to our lineage from beginning to end. But something did change, something almost beyond imagining. Around 252 million years ago, at the very end of the Permian, the world came as close to dying as it has ever come. Scientists call it the end-Permian extinction, but it has another name, a blunter one, the Great Dying. It is, without competition, the single worst catastrophe in the entire history of life on Earth. Nothing else even comes close. Not the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, not any event before or since. In the end-Permian, life on this planet was very nearly switched off completely. The likely trigger was buried in what is now Siberia. There, over a stretch of time, a staggering volume of molten rock erupted onto the surface, one of the largest volcanic outpourings the planet has ever known, flooding an area the size of a continent in lava again and again. But the lava itself was not the true killer. The real weapon was what came with it. Those eruptions tore through vast underground deposits of coal and other carbon and belched enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. The result was a runaway greenhouse. The planet overheated. The oceans warmed, grew acidic, and in their depths the oxygen drained away, turning huge swaths of the sea into a suffocating dead zone. On land and at sea, the chemistry of the whole world turned hostile at once, and life paid a price almost too large to believe. By most estimates, around 90% of all species in the ocean vanished, and the great majority of species on land died with them. Something on the order of 90% of all life on Earth was extinguished in a geological blink. The mighty Gorgonopsians, the top predators of the Permian, were gone entirely, their sabre-toothed reign over forever. Whole families of dicynodonts collapsed. The world of tusked grazers and saber-toothed beasts, the first age of the beasts, was shattered almost to nothing. For a time, the land fell strangely silent and empty, stripped of its rulers, a planet in recovery from a wound that would take millions of years to heal. But not everything died. Life is stubborn, and a scattered handful of survivors crawled out into that broken world. Among them was a small, tusked, barrel-bodied dicynodont called Lystrosaurus, an unglamorous, pig-sized survivor that became for a while one of the most common large land animals the world has ever seen, its bones turning up across the shattered continents. And crucially, some of the small Cynodonts survived too, the very group carrying the seeds of the mammal line, hanging on through the disaster in burrows and shadows, keeping our story alive by the thinnest of margins. But here is the turning point, the twist that changed the whole future of the planet. In the ruined greenhouse world that followed the Great Dying, our synapsid relatives, the survivors, never rose to dominance again. Instead, a different group of survivors seized the opportunity. In that hot, harsh, oxygen-poor aftermath, a lineage of reptiles called the archosaurs began to flourish. Animals with more efficient bodies for that punishing new world. The archosaurs were the ancestors of the crocodiles and of something else. Because from this group, in the period that followed, called the Triassic, would eventually rise the very first true dinosaurs. The empty throne left behind by the beasts was quietly claimed by the reptiles. And once the dinosaurs took hold, they would rule the land for the next 150 million years, the longest reign of any group of large animals in the history of the world. And our own ancestors, the synapsids that once dominated everything, they did not vanish, but they were pushed into the margins. Through the entire long age of dinosaurs, the descendants of those proud Permian rulers survived as something small. The first true mammals, when they finally appeared, were tiny, shrew-like creatures scurrying in the undergrowth, hiding in the dark, coming out at night, living in the cracks of a world owned by giants. For over 100 million years, our lineage waited in the shadows of the dinosaurs, patient, unnoticed, and alive. And we all know how that story ended. When another catastrophe, an asteroid, finally struck down the dinosaurs, it was the descendants of those small, patient survivors, the mammals, who inherited the Earth all over again. So the next time you see a dinosaur and imagine it as the first great ruler of the land, remember the deeper truth. Long before the dinosaurs, the Earth already had a ruler, and it was not them. It was our own strange, sail-backed, sabre-toothed, tusked, and whiskered relatives, the synapsids, who held the throne first. They lost it in the worst disaster the world has ever known. But their bloodline never truly let go. It simply waited through 100 million years of dinosaurs for the chance to rule again. The dinosaurs got the crown, but the throne, in the very beginning, was ours. And in the end, it would be ours once more.